He took the arrows to save the Apache woman, and not for a moment did he regret it. She thought she'd reached the end of the trail until someone leapt from the shadows and took the arrows meant for her. The first shot tore through the cottonwood trees like a scream, not a warning, a promise. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as her bare feet scraped against the gravel bed of the dried creek. The hem of her cedar-dyed tunic clung to her thighs, damp with sweat and streaked with blood from a wound she didn't have time to find. The sun over Nevada's red basin was blistering that day, hanging low and merciless like a watchful god. Every gust of desert wind was thick with gunpowder and rage. From behind came hoarse shouting English, not her mother tongue slurred by whiskey and hatred. "Get back here, Redskin. You can't run from what you owe." She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her lungs burned. Her feet bled. But something deeper her pride had broken long before this chase. It had been 3 weeks since she fled the compound near Gold Creek. 3 weeks since that man Cartwright tried to barter her body for land rights. 3 weeks since her own tribe had turned their backs when she refused a forced marriage to the chief's cousin. Since the baby she once carried, her son, was taken for his own safety and placed into a mission far east. She had nothing left but her name. And now they were trying to take that, too. If you love cowboy love stories and Western tales of healing, comment 1 and your place below to show Wild West love some trail dust and support. She stumbled, knees buckling as her hand reached for a branch to steady herself. It snapped under her grip, too dry, too old, just like every promise ever made to her. Another shout, another shot, closer, and then silence. A hush so sharp it rang louder than the bullets. Suddenly, from a thicket of mountain laurel up ahead, a figure stepped out. He was tall, 6 foot, maybe more, with a weather-worn duster hanging from one shoulder like a shadow. A battered hat tipped low over one side of his face, obscuring a deep scar that ran from temple to jaw. His right hand hung near his belt, just above a revolver so clean it caught the sun like a mirror. The man didn't move fast. He didn't speak, just stood there like the mountains themselves had grown tired of watching cruelty and sent down something harder. The silence shattered when Ilara's foot cracked on a dry twig. Their eyes met. His were gray, not cold, but tired, not empty, but hollowed out like something had lived in them once, then left. "Ilara," she whispered, unsure why. The man didn't flinch. Behind her, hooves thundered. 2 riders, close now, too close. He stepped forward, slow as dusk, and without a word reached behind him, not for his gun, but a bow. She blinked. A bow? A whisper of air, then a hiss, then pain. He'd turned and fired an arrow at the rider nearest to Ilara, knocking him clean off his saddle. The second rider pulled hard on his reins, confused, and then charged. The man, still quiet, didn't retreat. Instead, he took the second arrow, aimed, and released. The second rider fell before his scream could reach the trees. And then silence again. But the third sound Ilara heard was the soft, horrible thud of the man falling to his knees. An arrow shaft stuck clean through his shoulder. She rushed forward without thinking. The desert had hardened her, but not to blood. "Why?" she gasped, gripping his arm. His voice was sand and smoke. "Didn't like the way they called you Redskin. You don't even know me. You ran like you had nothing left. That's enough." His name was Silas Hawthorne. He didn't talk about himself, not in the first 2 days. Ilara only knew what the cabin told her. A man who hadn't touched the outside world in maybe 5 years. A map tacked to the wall had pins marking every ridge, spring, and trail in the canyon. There were no photos, no letters, but a single child's toy, a wooden horse, rested on the dusty mantel. He never mentioned it. She didn't ask. But the silence was not unfriendly. It was earned. Silas didn't trust people, not after the war. "Elk Mountain 1864, he said once. "Wasn't a battle, was a culling. We didn't fight soldiers, we killed families." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. At night, when his wound throbbed too hard to sleep, he sat on the porch and whittled tiny figures of animals from pieces of pine. He carved a bear, an eagle, even a rabbit. Ilara noticed he gave the rabbit the most detail. "Why that one?" she asked one night. "Fast, small, but always watching," he muttered. Then, after a pause, Like you. Their connection grew not from words, but from rhythm. Alara cooked. Silas hunted. She cleaned. He chopped wood. She mended the tears in his coat. He fixed the lock on her door. When a late autumn storm rolled in cold and furious, she found herself at the hearth, brushing the hair from his eyes as he slept, sweat beading on his brow. She whispered a lullaby in her old tongue's soft syllables passed from grandmothers who once danced around fire circles. Silas stirred but didn't wake. For the first time in a year, her hands didn't shake. On the 5th day, she found a letter unopened on his writing desk. The seal read Federal Pension Office. She placed it back carefully. "Why don't you open it?" she asked that evening. "Because I know what it says," he said, staring at the stars, "and because none of it can undo what I did." Alara exhaled slowly, then said, "I know that feeling," and for the first time, he turned to really look at her. She told him about the child, about the mission, about how they said she was unfit because she refused the tribal council's will, how her body had been claimed and blamed in the same breath. "They called me cursed," she said, her voice like ashes, "and I started to believe them." Silas reached for her hand. "You're not cursed. You're survivin'." The next morning, she braided her hair for the first time in months. He watched her, silent. When she tucked a fresh feather into the braid, a black hawk feather he had left by her door, he smiled. Not a grin, just a soft lifting at the corner of his mouth. But it was enough to melt something frozen between them. 1 week later, a rider came from Gold Creek. Alara tensed when she saw him through the window, a man with a silver badge and too many questions. "Heard tell you had a squaw up here," the man said to Silas. "We got law about harboring fugitives." Silas didn't reach for his gun. He just stepped aside and said, "No fugitives here. Only folks with scars." The man sneered. "You one of them peace, lovin' types now?" Silas answered flatly, "Number, but I don't kill without reason anymore." "Lev." That was enough. The man rode off. Ilara's eyes brimmed, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took Silas's old coat and began stitching a new lining into it, one patterned with the colors of her people. Rust red, midnight blue, earth brown. "This is not for hiding," she said. "This is for standing." Silas touched her cheek. "Then let's stand together." The first morning after the arrows, the cabin smelled of blood and pine sap. Alara woke to the rhythmic creak of wood. Not threatening, familiar. The cabin was breathing again. Outside, frost still clung to the corners of the window, curling like ghosts along the glass. But inside, it was warm not just from the fire, but from the quiet presence of another human heart. Silas sat in the corner, his arm bandaged with a strip of his old shirt, dark with dried blood. He hadn't asked for help. He didn't need to. Alara had cleaned the wound the night before, grinding wild yarrow and bearberry into a bitter paste, pressing it into his flesh with calloused fingers that didn't tremble. She didn't speak then, and he didn't ask where she'd learned that. In truth, she hadn't touched another man's skin since the night she was taken. But Silas had not flinched, and that gave her hands courage. Now, she watched him from the cot, half shielded in the morning haze. His scarred face was turned toward the fire, eyes closed but not asleep, like he was listening to the way the flames breathed. He broke the silence. "You know what you're doing." She sat up slowly, the blanket still wrapped around her legs. "With herbs? With wounds?" She looked down. "I've seen too many." He didn't answer, but something in the room settled like two wild animals circling each other, finally choosing to sit instead of run. That day passed without words. Alara swept the floor, carefully, not for cleanliness, but because moving kept her from thinking too much. Her bare feet were still sore, so she wrapped them in cloth and tied them with deer hide. She found a pot near the hearth and scrubbed it with ash and snow water. Then boiled lentils and dried corn with marrow bones she found hanging on the rafters. The smell wasn't delicious, but it was nourishing. Silas, with one arm useless, nodded when she set the bowl in front of him. "You cook like someone who remembers hunger," he said. She paused. "I do." Later, while he slept in the rocker, snoring faintly, Alara took his coat, the one torn by brush and smoke, and sat by the light. She found a sewing kit in a cedar box. The needle was bent, the thread uneven, but her fingers knew the rhythm. Stitch by stitch, she closed the wound in the fabric, the same way she had once stitched shut the chest of a child cut open by a bear trap. That boy hadn't made it, but this coat would. She didn't realize Silas was watching until he spoke. "Why help me?" Her fingers froze. She didn't look up. "You didn't ask me who I am," she said. "Didn't need to." He shifted forward, grimacing at the pain. "You weren't running like a criminal. You were running like someone who'd been chased too long." Her throat tightened. "And you," she said, looking at him now, "you didn't kill those men because you knew me." "Number." "Then why?" He was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "Because once, a woman stood in front of me and took a bullet that wasn't hers. She didn't know me either." Ilara exhaled, something in her chest loosening for the first time in weeks. "Did she survive?" she whispered. Silas' jaw tightened. "Number." The next few days fell into a rhythm soft and strange, like a song hummed in a language neither of them fully remembered. Ilara found dried sage and lavender hanging above the hearth. She crushed them, added them to boiled water, and cleaned the cabin inch by inch, not for beauty, but for breath. The air began to smell like something alive again. She mended a second blanket, repaired a chair, rearranged the shelf of tools so the handles pointed the same way. It wasn't tidiness. It was memory of order, of control, of surviving by knowing where things were. Silas didn't interfere. Each evening, he lit the lantern by the window at exactly the same time, just before the light died. He said it was for travelers. But Ilara knew better. "You think someone's still looking for you?" she asked once. "No," he replied, eyes on the flame. "But I think I still need to be found." One night, after a short snow, they sat near the fire with cups of bitter coffee. No sugar, just warmth. Ilara reached into her satchel, the only thing she'd carried from her old life, and pulled out a strip of blue cloth, embroidered with white beads. "It was for my son," she said quietly. "I was sewing it for his naming day." Silas said nothing, just looked at the cloth, then at her. "What happened to him?" he asked gently. "They said he was unfit to grow up among women like me. Too wild, too cursed." She swallowed. "They sent him east, to a mission school. And his father?" Her hands stiffened. "He promised he'd fight for us," she said. "Then he married the chief's niece and said I was inconvenient." Silas said nothing for a long time. Then, softly, "Some men wear honor like a coat, only when it's cold." She looked at him, really looked. Noticed the way his left hand always trembled when he held a cup, the way he flinched when thunder rumbled, the way he never sat with his back to a door. "You were a soldier," she said. He nodded once. "I was trained to kill, but no one trained me how to live after." She reached over and, for the first time, touched his scar. "Maybe that's what we're both learning." The next morning, Silas found Ilara outside, kneeling in the frost, pressing her palms into the earth. "What are you doing?" "Giving thanks," she said. "My people believe the ground remembers those who walk softly." Silas looked down at his boots. "I haven't walked softly in years." Ilara stood, brushing snow from her knees. "Then start now." Later, as they repaired the cabin's fence, Ilara found a black feather caught in the wire. Smooth, long, unbroken. She held it up. "From a raven," she said. "Not bad luck?" She shook her head. "Not for my people. Ravens carry messages between the wounded and the sky." That night, she wove the feather into her braid. Silas watched her, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. It wasn't desire. Not yet. It was something older, something more dangerous. Hope. They didn't speak of the future. Not yet. But one evening, as snow fell in silence and the fire crackled low, Ilara curled beside him, not out of need but choice. He shifted, unsure, but didn't pull away. Their hands touched. Scars brushed scars, and for a moment, in the quiet canyon that had swallowed so many cries, there was peace. The road into Gold Creek wasn't marked on any map. It slithered through dry gulches and over ridgelines scorched by summer sun and winter fire. But Ilara knew it by heart, not the turns of the path, but the weight in her chest with every step closer. She hadn't set foot near town since the night she bled into the sagebrush and left behind her name, her child, and the little piece of hope she'd stitched into every bead of her tunic. Now, beside her, rode the man who had taken an arrow for her, Silas. His horse was old, his saddle older. He didn't speak much, but the way he rode slow, steady, always scanning the horizon made Ilara feel like, for the first time, she wasn't returning alone. They reached the ridge just before sundown. From there, the town looked the same. Crooked chimney smoke, rows of clapboard buildings lining a single dirt road, and the church spire thin, sharp, like a judgmental finger aimed at heaven. Ilara's throat tightened. "Still want to go?" Silas asked. She looked down at her hands gripping the reins. Nails short, knuckles scarred, but steady. "I have to," she said. They rode in just as the saloon lanterns were being lit. Gold Creek had about 80 souls on a good day, miners, trappers, God-fearing women, and God-forgetting men. The kind of town where stories outran truth, and justice came in the form of whispers or bullets. As they passed, heads turned. First, because Silas hadn't been seen in town in over 5 years. Second, because the woman riding beside him wasn't white. Some muttered, some stared. One boy pointed, but Ilara sat straight. Her spine, a bowstring, her eyes calm. They stopped at the general store. Silas dismounted first. "Need flour, salt, and more thread." Ilara nodded and stepped off behind him. The door creaked. The bell jingled. Inside, it was quiet until a voice cut through the air. "Well, I'll be damned. Cartwright." Ilara froze. He stood near the shelf of canned beans, a cigar half lit in his teeth, and a smirk carved across his face like a wound that never healed right. "Didn't think I'd see you back in these parts," he drawled. "Figured you'd be strung up by now, or dead in some ditch where you belong." Silas turned, slow. His eyes were cold, his voice colder. "Put the cigar down." Cartwright laughed. "Ain't talking to you, Hawthorne. Talking to the squaw who ran off with stolen horses and bad manners." Ilara stepped forward. The room held its breath. "You still wear that coat?" she asked, her voice steady. Cartwright blinked. "The one you took from my brother's body after he died in your trap?" The smirk faltered. "You think no one remembered? You think blood doesn't stain just 'cause you bury the body deep?" Cartwright's hand twitched toward his belt, but Silas had already stepped between them. "You raise that hand," he said calmly. "You won't get the chance to lower it." Cartwright hesitated, then spat. "Wasn't worth the trouble then, ain't worth it now." He left. The store was silent again. The shopkeep cleared his throat. "Salt's in the back, thread too." Outside, Ilara exhaled slowly. She'd faced him. She hadn't flinched. For the first time in years, her shoulders didn't feel like they were bearing someone else's shame. Silas handed her a small pouch. "Peppermint candy," he said. "Thought you might like it." She smiled. Not wide, but real. "Thank you." They stayed that night in the back room of an old widow's bakery, a friend of Silas's from long ago. Mrs. Leona made them stew and bread and told them the town had changed, mostly for worse, but a few surprises. That night, in the flickering lamplight, Ilara pulled from her satchel the torn sleeve of her old dress, the one she'd worn when she fled. It still had soot, blood, and beads missing. She sat by the window, unwinding the remaining beads. Then she took out new ones, some she'd traded for earlier that day, found at the back of the general store. Turquoise, bone white, sky blue. Silas watched her quietly. "You're not just repairing it," he said. She shook her head. "I'm telling a new story, with the same thread." He nodded. "I've got scars that ache when it rains, but they ache less when you're near." Her hand paused. She looked up, then reached over and gently touched the place just above his bandage. "Then maybe the ache is the price of remembering, not punishment." The next morning, they visited the mission school, a tall wooden building with a rusted bell, neatly painted, quiet, too quiet. The matron met them on the steps, strict face, stiff collar. "Ilara of the Seedguard tribe?" She nodded. "We no longer have the boy. He was sent to Carson 2 months ago." "Why?" "Church orders. Said the boy wasn't learning obedience. Said he spoke too much of his mother." Ilara's hands clenched. "Where is he now?" "We don't track them once they leave," the matron said flatly. "Then you'll start," Silas growled. The woman shrank back. That night, back at the cabin, Ilara lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill, not for her son, but for herself, the girl who had been shamed, silenced, Stripped of her place, she was not coming back, because she'd never left. She had only been waiting for her voice to catch up to her courage. Silas came to stand beside her. She leaned against him, feeling the quiet strength in his chest. The way he didn't ask anything of her, just stood. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. But when she finally said, "I'm ready to go back," he asked, "To where?" She turned to him. "To myself." Spring came slow to the canyon, first in the scent-damp soil and the shy sweetness of budding sage. Then in the sounds birds that hadn't sung in months, creeks whispering as the frost gave way. And then, finally, in color bursts of wildflowers, carving their way up from between stones, as if the earth itself remembered how to bloom. Ilara stood barefoot in the soft dirt behind the cabin, a woven shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She had dug 6 neat rows by hand. In each, she placed seeds: corn, squash, chamomile, red clover. The names whispered through her fingers like prayers. They were not just plants. They were memory, survival, future. Behind her, the door creaked. Silas leaned against the frame, his coat slung loose over one shoulder. The scar on his cheek looked softer in the morning light. "You sure that patch'll grow anything?" he asked. Ilara didn't turn. "Everything grows when it's not afraid." He nodded once. "Suppose that's true for folks, too." They didn't speak of love in words. Not yet. But in the way they shared space, it became undeniable. He left her the warm side of the bedroll when he rose early. She left extra honey in his coffee, even when he pretended not to notice. They moved around each other the way trees move with the wind, slow, natural, necessary. And yet, there was still something Silas held back. A distance in his eyes when she touched his shoulder, a flinch in his breath when she laughed too loudly. One night she asked him gently, "Do you believe you deserve this?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then, "Number." Ilara didn't push. She only reached for his hand. "Then let me show you." They worked side by side each day. She turned soil. He split wood. She mended torn curtains with bits of cloth. He crafted a new fence gate from cedar branches. When rain fell, they stayed inside, cooking stew and telling small stories, not of the past, but of recipes, of trees, of how to tell if a storm would last. One morning, Silas brought in a carved wooden box. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, setting it on the table. Inside were beads. Dozens, all kinds. Some old and chipped, some gleaming, some clearly traded from other lands, blue glass from the East Coast, bone beads from the Dakota Plains, brass loops worn smooth by time. "My mama used to collect 'em," he said. "Kept 'em in a jar by her bed. After she passed, I took the box and kept adding to it. Never knew why. Guess I thought, someday, they might mean something again." Ilara stared at the box, eyes shining. She picked up one small bead, black onyx, smooth and cool. "I'll sew it into my sleeve," she whispered, "so I remember this day." Silas' voice cracked. "Why this day?" She smiled. "Because today, you gave me something without running from what it meant." That night, they slept close, not out of cold, but out of knowing. Ilara's head rested on his chest. She listened to the slow rhythm of his heart like a lullaby. Silas, wide awake, ran his fingers through her hair, slow and unsure, like touching something fragile and sacred. "I still dream of war," he whispered. "I still dream of fire," she replied. "And if those dreams come back, then we'll wake each other." He turned, kissed her forehead, and in the stillness of that spring night, something that had long been buried deep in his chest, darker than guilt, older than sorrow, began to thaw. Weeks passed. The garden grew. Tomato vines stretched upward like prayers. Squash leaves fanned out wide. The clover came in small patches, purple and gold. Ilara sang while she worked. Not loud, not for anyone to hear, just for the plants, just for herself. Silas watched her from the porch, watched how she moved, grounded, alive, rooted, and realized he had never truly seen a woman until her. Not like this, not free of shame, not lit by her own light. One evening, as they shared roasted rabbit and cornbread, Ilara touched her stomach. A soft, supple motion. Silas noticed, paused, waited. Ilara didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a voice as steady as the canyon walls, "I'm late, by 3 moons." Silas didn't breathe. Then, slowly, almost reverently, he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. Warm, gentle, unshaking. Then we build for 3 now, he said. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time, they weren't from grief. They were release. She leaned forward, forehead against his. And in that moment, with nothing but the wind outside and the quiet fire between them, the two of them became a family. Not by blood, but by choice. Later that night, Silas pulled open an old drawer and retrieved a thin, worn ring. It was my mother's, he said. Found it in the ashes after the fire. She wore it even when Papa stopped wearing his. Ilara took it gently, held it in her palm. Not flashy, not gold, just silver and memory. Silas didn't kneel, but his voice trembled. I ain't asking for a ceremony, or a preacher, or even promises I can't keep. Just let me stand beside you, whatever this world becomes. Lau. Ilara nodded, tears falling freely now. You already are. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. A few nights later, thunder cracked across the canyon. Ilara woke, gasping, sweat on her brow, eyes wide. Silas sat up immediately. What is it? She shook her head. The dream, the child. I saw him, crying, calling. Silas pulled her into his chest, held her. We'll find him, he said. We'll go to Carson. We'll bring him home. She looked up. You'd go that far? I'd go farther. Morning came with a cool wind. The canyon shimmered in the gold of early light. Ilara stood at the fence, watching the tomato vines sway. She placed her hand on her belly. A new life. A new chance. Silas came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wind carried their silence like a song, part grief, part hope, all real. Carson lay 3 days' ride to the east, past the dry bones of wagon trails and rivers that no longer remembered how to flow. They left just after sunrise. Ilara packed dried fruit, smoked rabbit, and the last of the cornmeal. Silas strapped his rifle behind the saddle, not for hunting but for ghosts. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew this journey wasn't just for a child. It was a reckoning. Ilara wore the beaded sleeve she had stitched weeks before, now covered in new patterns, a raven for memory, a sunburst for hope, and a small spiral over her heart, a mark of return. Around her neck hung a pouch with 4 seeds, one for each season she'd survived since losing her son. Silas wore his mother's ring on a leather cord around his neck. He had offered to give it to Ilara again before they rode, but she had said no. Let it stay near your heart, she'd whispered, where it began. Duda. They traveled in silence the first day, broken only by the creak of leather, the call of far-off hawks, and the sound of hooves crunching through scrub. At night, they made camp near a dry wash, the stars spilling over them like scattered salt. Ilara stirred the fire with a branch. Her belly, just beginning to round, moved softly beneath the blanket. Do you think he'll remember me? She asked. Silas leaned back on one elbow, chewing dried jerky. He won't need to, he said. You're in his bones. On the second day, they crossed paths with a peddler named Amos, who wore too many buttons and not enough teeth. He offered them news for a price. Silas gave him a silver coin. Mission school just west of Carson, Amos said. Run by folk meaner than God's wrath and colder than mountain snow. Took in a boy not long ago. Tan skin, wild eyes. Said he bit the preacher. Ilara's breath caught. He's there, she said. Silas nodded, but Amos wasn't done. Rumor is, they planning to ship him further east military school in Missouri. Tame the fire out of him. That boy don't got much time. Silas's jaw clenched. Then we ride faster. They arrived just after sundown on the third day. The mission stood on a low hill, whitewashed, stone-faced, a crucifix stabbing the sky. Children's voices echoed faintly from inside, too orderly, too rehearsed. They waited until morning. At first light, Silas approached the door. Ilara stayed behind, hidden under her shawl near the side wall. The door opened. A man in black robes stepped out, wiry, pale, lips thin with control. Can I help you? The man asked. I'm looking for a boy, Silas said. His name's Ashen, son of Ilara of the Seed Guard. The man's face stiffened. Unauthorized visits are prohibited. The child is under church jurisdiction." "I didn't ask," Silas replied. The priest stepped forward. "The boy is disobedient, wild. We're preparing him for a better life." Ilara appeared beside Silas before he could speak. Her voice cut through the morning like steel. "You mean a life where he forgets his mother tongue, where he prays to gods he never met, in a uniform that hides his skin?" The priest blinked, surprised. "He's not yours anymore." "He was never yours," she said. There was a long silence. Then a child's voice, "Mama?" Ilara turned. A boy stood at the edge of the courtyard, maybe 6, maybe 7. His eyes were wide, his hair cut short, his shirt too tight, but his mouth, that was hers. That same stubborn line, that same fire. She ran to him. He hesitated for a moment, then ran back. She fell to her knees as he crashed into her chest. "Mama." "My little star," she whispered. "My Ashen." The priest protested, raised his voice, threatened guards and laws. But Silas stepped between them. "You touch her," he said, "and I'll show you why I ain't welcome in half the territories west of the Rockies." The priest stepped back. Silas turned to Ilara. "We leave now." They didn't stop riding until the mission was 5 miles behind them. Ashen rode with Ilara, clinging tight. He didn't speak much, but he never let go. That night, under a sky swollen with stars, they made camp near a shallow creek. Ilara brushed Ashen's hair with her fingers, humming the song she used to sing when he was in her belly. Silas watched from across the fire. He saw her face, the way her eyes closed as she hummed, saw the boy's cheek resting against her collarbone, saw the flame of something sacred that no war had managed to kill. He felt something catch in his throat. He stood up, walked into the trees. Ilara found him near dawn. He was standing ankle-deep in the creek, looking up at the sky. "You left your coat," she said softly. He didn't look at her, didn't feel the cold. She stepped closer. "What are you afraid of?" Silas exhaled. "I'm afraid I don't know how to be good," he said. Ilara was quiet. Then, "Goodness isn't something you are. It's something you choose, one moment at a time." He turned to her. "And what if I fail?" She smiled. "Then we get back up, together." They returned to the canyon 1 week later. The cabin stood just as they left it, pine needles scattered across the porch, a hawk feather caught in the doorframe. Ilara took Ashen's hand and led him inside. He explored everything, the tiny bed, the beaded cloth, the jars of dried herbs. He found the rabbit carving Silas had whittled and held it like treasure. "This yours?" he asked. "No," Silas said. "Yours now." That night, they ate stew by the fire. Ilara leaned against Silas. Ashen fell asleep curled beside them, his small hand gripping his mother's sleeve. Silas stared into the fire for a long time, then whispered, "This is what peace feels like." In the weeks that followed, the canyon changed again. Ashen planted his own row of sunflowers. Silas built him a bow, small, smooth, safe. Ilara taught him to grind herbs and sing old songs into the soil. They weren't just surviving now, they were living. Each day was ordinary, and each day was a miracle. On the first day of summer, Ilara gave birth under the canopy of stars. No doctor, no preacher, just Silas, Ashen, and the earth. A daughter. Small, fierce, loud. Ilara wept as she held her. Ashen kissed her tiny fingers. Silas whispered, "Welcome home." They buried the past not by forgetting it, but by building over it, with every seed planted, with every bead sown, with every quiet night where no one had to run. They turned their scars into roots. And the canyon, once full of echoes and sorrow, bloomed. The cabin no longer creaked like it used to. The wood, once dry and brittle, had been resealed. The floor swept clean. Ashen's laughter echoed in the corners now, bouncing off the beams like sunlight through canyon gaps. He had grown taller in just 3 moons. His feet no longer stumbled over the doorstep. His questions came quicker than the wind. About stars, about boughs, about why the sunflowers always turned their faces east. Silas never had answers for everything, but he listened, always. Ilara, in the early mornings, would hum while nursing the baby by the window. Her eyes looked different now, not softer, but clearer, like someone who had walked through fire and remembered her own name on the other side. Sometimes, when the baby slept, she would sew her fingers steady, her back straight, her needle moving with the memory of generations. She stitched not for beauty, but for meaning, patterns of thunder, of spiral paths, of hands held together in stormlight. One of the sleeves bore a pattern Silas finally asked about one evening, long after the sky had turned purple and the coyotes had begun to cry in the far ridges. "What's that one?" he asked, pointing. Ilera smiled. "It means, where pain was, we built a place to rest." Silas nodded, pressing his thumb over the thread. "I reckon that's what we've done." They no longer feared visitors. Every so often, a traveler passed through. Sometimes a rider who'd lost his way. Sometimes a widow returning east. Once, even a young preacher who came asking about the woman who took her child back from the church. Silas stood in the doorway that day, arms crossed. "She's not taking questions," he said. The man left with his collar tight and his pride bruised. But others came in peace. And sometimes, Alara welcomed them in. She poured them tea, asked them where they'd been. And slowly, a strange thing happened in the canyon. It became known, not famous, not marked on any map, but remembered. Whispers of the woman who stood tall and the man with the scar who built peace made their way to trading posts, to story circles, even to wandering minstrels who sang under starlight. And though Alara never sought attention, something in her heart warmed each time a stranger arrived, seeking not help, but hope. Ashen grew strong. The baby, whom they named Isha after the word for light after storm, learned to crawl across sun-warmed floorboards. Silas aged with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Some days, when the wind came cold from the north, he sat on the porch wrapped in his mother's old blanket, watching the canyon with watchful eyes. Once, Ilara sat beside him and asked, "Do the ghosts still come?" He thought for a long time. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but now, they don't stay long." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Neither do storms." On the first anniversary of their return, they planted a tree behind the cabin, an old cottonwood sapling, taken from the creek bed below. Ashen helped dig the hole. Silas poured water. Ilara placed a small stone beneath the roots, one she had carved with a raven, a sun, and two hands holding a sprout. "This is for what we lost," she said, "and what we became." They didn't speak for a while after that, but the silence wasn't heavy. It was sacred. If you ever passed through that canyon, if you followed the narrow trail along the rocks until it dipped beneath the whispering pines, you might find the cabin. You'd see smoke rising gently from the chimney. You might hear a child laugh, or the lull of a soft lullaby in a language older than borders. And if you knocked, someone would open the door. A man with tired eyes and a strong voice. A woman with hands that healed. Two children who had never been taught to fear. And you'd feel something you couldn't name. Not safety, not comfort, something stronger, belonging. Because in that place carved from hurt, mended by hands, softened by time, love had taken root. And it was growing still,